Most unsolved murders stay unsolved because no one looked closely enough. This one stayed unsolved because, in 1867, 12 people looked as closely as the law allowed and still couldn't agree on what they saw. In 2012, a genealogist in Scotland sat down at a research desk in Perth's A.K. Bell Library with a death certificate he had pulled from the archive weeks earlier. He was not looking for a murder. He was building a family tree, the kind of quiet weekend project that usually ends in nothing more dramatic than a misspelled surname or a birth date off by a year. But one line on that certificate stopped him. The space where a cause of death should have been recorded had been left conspicuously, almost defiantly, blank. Not illegible, not damaged, blank, as though the clerk who filled it in had run out of words or had been told not to use the ones he had. The woman named on that certificate was his great-great-great-grandmother. Her name was Janet Rogers. And the file he was about to open, parish registers, newspaper columns gone brittle with age, a criminal court record filed away in the National Archives of Scotland, had not been seriously examined by anyone outside a Perthshire courtroom in 146 years. What he found, over the months that followed, was not a solved mystery waiting to be rediscovered. It was the opposite, a case the 19th century had tried, weighed, and ultimately declined to close, sealed not with a verdict of innocence or guilt, but with a shrug written into the law itself. To understand why a Scottish court in 1867 could look directly at the evidence in this case and still walk away without an answer, it is necessary to go back further than the murder itself, back to the ground it happened on and the world that ground produced. Before we begin, if historical cases like this interest you, subscribing helps this channel keep researching and telling them properly. Now, let's go back to where it started. The case of Janet Rogers begins in Perthshire, Scotland, in 1866. To understand why that blank line on a death certificate could sit unexamined for over a century, it is necessary to understand the world Janet Rogers was born into. A world of tenant farms, weaving villages, and a rigid, unspoken order that governed who spoke to whom, who worked for whom, and who was believed when something went wrong. Perthshire in the 19th century was agricultural country, stitched together by large estates and the tenant farmers who worked them. Farms like the one at the centre of this story were not owned by the families who ran them. They were leased, often on terms that left little room for financial error, from landlords who lived comfortably at a remove from the daily labour of the land. A bad harvest, a sick horse, an unpaid debt to a neighbouring tenancy, any of it could tip a farming family from stability into precarity within a single season, and that precarity shaped how people in this world treated one another. Reputation was currency, a name spoken carelessly, a servant let go without good reason, a debt mentioned in the wrong company. These things travelled through a rural parish faster than any road could carry them. Beneath the tenant farmers sat a further tier, ploughmen, dairymaids, and domestic servants, workers who were hired by the season or the year, who lived under their employer's roof, and who could be dismissed with little notice and less explanation. It was a structure built on proximity and dependency. Employers and servants shared kitchens, shared meals, and shared silence about a great deal that happened inside those walls. A servant's entire livelihood, and often their lodging, hinged on the goodwill of an employer who could end the arrangement over a disagreement, an accusation, or simply a change of mind. This meant that grievances in households like these rarely surfaced as open conflict. They surfaced sideways, in a sudden dismissal, a hurried departure, a family taking in a former servant who had nowhere else to go. It is exactly this kind of sideways movement of people that would come to define the final days of Janet Rogers's life, though none of the people involved could have known it at the time. Janet Rogers, née Henderson, had been born around 1811 in Airntully, a small village a short distance from where she would later die, known locally for its cottage weaving trade. It was the kind of place where a family's income came from many hands working many small jobs: a loom in one room, a kitchen garden out back, a husband who travelled for estate labour when the local work ran dry. Janet married a labourer named James Rogers in the 1830s. James spent long stretches of the year working away from home, on the larger estates that could afford to hire outside labour, which meant that for much of their married life, the running of the household fell to Janet alone. The couple had 5 daughters. By 1866, Janet was 55 years old, a grandmother several times over, and by every surviving account, a woman whose life had settled into the steady, unremarkable rhythm of a rural working household. What Janet Rogers looked like is not established in the sources recovered from this period. No photograph of her is known to survive. Her voice, her manner, the small daily habits that might have made her recognizable to a stranger walking into that kitchen, none of it is documented. What is documented is function. Daughter, wife, mother of 5, sister to a farmer named William Henderson. It is through that last relationship, sister to William, that Janet Rogers entered the final chapter of her life, and it is that relationship the surviving record chooses to preserve, almost to the exclusion of everything else about her. In March of 1866, William Henderson found himself short-handed. He ran a tenancy known as Mount Stuart Farm, near the village of Forgan-Denny, and he had recently dismissed his domestic servant, a young woman named Christina Miller. Farm households of this size did not run themselves. Someone needed to cook, clean, and manage the kitchen while Henderson searched for a replacement. He turned, as many men in his position did, to family. His sister Janet agreed to come and help out at Mount Stuart Farm until a new servant could be found. A temporary arrangement, expected to last only as long as it took to fill the vacancy. She arrived at the farm in the last week of March. She would be dead within days. The other figure the record insists on placing near this household in the spring of 1866 is a ploughman named James Crichton, employed on or near the Mount Stuart tenancy. What can be said of Crichton with confidence is limited, and what cannot be confirmed should not be invented. His exact age, his physical appearance, and the precise terms of his employment are not fully preserved in the surviving documentation, though he is consistently identified in contemporary accounts as a ploughman working in the vicinity of Henderson's farm, a labouring man embedded in the same tight, dependent web of rural employment as everyone else in this story. What is better documented is his connection to the household through Christina Miller, the servant Henderson had just dismissed. After losing her position at Mount Stuart Farm, Miller went to stay with James Crichton and his wife. That detail, a fired servant taking shelter with a ploughman and his family in the very same weeks a murder was about to occur nearby, is one that would prove consequential in the months that followed. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, back to the record. The tension that would eventually surface in this case did not announce itself loudly. It surfaces, instead, through a sequence of small dismissals and small relocations, the kind of friction that rural households absorbed constantly and rarely wrote down. Christina Miller's dismissal from Mount Stuart Farm placed her, within days, inside the household of a man who would later become the case's central suspect. Whatever resentment, loyalty, or simple proximity that arrangement created is not spelled out in any surviving letter or testimony from the period itself. It exists only in outline: a servant let go, a ploughman who took her in, a farmhouse a short walk away where the fired servant's former employer's sister had just arrived to fill her old role. The record does not explain motive. It only arranges the pieces close enough together that a reader is left to wonder. To place this case in its wider moment, Scotland in 1866 was operating under a criminal justice system considerably different from what would follow it. Rural policing was thin, forensic science in its infancy, and criminal investigation in areas like Perthshire relied heavily on local constables, circumstantial testimony, and the word of neighbours who often had every reason to protect one another. Scottish criminal procedure also carried a peculiarity that would come to define this case specifically: a third possible verdict, alongside guilty and not guilty, known as not proven. It allowed a jury to conclude that a suspect was probably responsible without being satisfied enough by the evidence presented to formally convict. It was a verdict built for exactly the kind of case Perthshire was about to produce: strong suspicion, weak proof. On the 30th of March 1866, Janet Rogers was found dead in the kitchen of Mount Stewart Farm. She had been struck multiple times with an axe. The details of the attack itself are not fully reconstructible from the surviving record. The number of blows, their precise sequence, and the exact circumstances under which Janet was caught alone in the kitchen are not established with certainty, and this account will not invent them. What can be stated is that the assault was violent, close range, and left considerable blood spatter across the walls and furniture of the room, according to those who later described the scene. She had been at the farm only a matter of days. What followed the killing was not chaos, but a strange, deliberate order, a detail that criminologists re-examining this case more than a century later would find significant. The body was not left exposed. It was, according to later accounts, covered and the farmhouse secured, as though whoever was responsible had taken care to manage the scene rather than flee it in panic. This is not the behaviour typically associated with a stranger interrupted mid-burglary. It is the behaviour of someone familiar with the house, its rhythms, and perhaps its occupants. Someone who had time and reason to think before acting. The discovery of Janet's body did not come from any investigative process. It came, as these things often did in rural households of the period, through the ordinary business of the farm continuing around a silence that had gone on too long. Someone in or near the household noticed that Janet had not appeared, went looking, and found her in the kitchen. There was no detective work involved in the finding, only the accident of someone walking into a room they expected to be occupied by a living woman going about her chores. What followed was not a swift manhunt, but a slow, uneven investigation that stretched across most of a year. Local suspicion in the immediate aftermath fell in more than one direction, toward William Henderson himself, whose account of events contained inconsistencies that investigators and, much later, modern reviewers of the case would note, and toward James Crichton, the ploughman with ties to the household through the dismissed servant. Constables in a rural Perthshire parish in 1866 were not detectives in any modern sense. There was no forensic laboratory to send evidence to, no fingerprinting, no way to establish a precise time of death beyond the observations of whoever found the body. What investigation existed relied almost entirely on interviews, asking neighbours what they had seen, asking household members to account for their movements and hoping that somewhere in the accumulation of small, contradictory statements, a pattern would emerge that pointed decisively in one direction. For months, it did not. The spring planting season came and went. Summer moved through the district, and with it the seasonal rhythms of a farming community that could not simply pause its labor to wait for an answer. Fields still needed ploughing. Livestock still needed tending. And through all of it, according to the surviving record, the household connected to Mount Stewart Farm continued to function under the weight of an unanswered question, neighbors watching neighbors, suspicion accumulating in small, unspoken increments rather than any single dramatic breakthrough. Rural policing in Perthshire in 1866 had neither the manpower nor the forensic tools to move quickly against circumstantial suspicion, and the case appeared, for a stretch of that year, to be settling into the kind of quiet stagnation that swallowed a great many rural crimes of the period. Cases that were never formally closed, simply left to grow cold under the accumulating weight of everyday life continuing around them. The break, when it came, arrived through testimony rather than detective work. Christina Miller, the servant dismissed from Mount Stewart Farm before the murder, now living under Crichton's roof, told investigators that 2 days after Janet's death, she had overheard James Crichton confess to the killing. It was her account, delivered months after the fact, that gave investigators enough to move. Just before Christmas 1866, James Crichton was arrested. Medical testimony presented in connection with the case described injuries consistent with repeated blunt force trauma from a bladed farm implement, though the surviving record of the post-mortem examination is not detailed enough to reconstruct with full technical precision, and this account will not manufacture specifics beyond what has been preserved. What is clear from contemporary description is that the injuries were severe, concentrated, and inflicted at close range. Consistent with an assailant, Janet Rogers may have had no reason to fear until the moment the attack began. A stranger forcing entry typically leaves a different signature behind, a struggle that moves through a house, evidence of forced doors or broken windows, a victim caught fleeing rather than standing her ground in her own kitchen. None of that is what the surviving descriptions suggest. Janet appears, by every account that has come down through the record, to have been killed exactly where she stood, doing exactly what she had come to the farm to do. A detail later reviewers of the case would return to again and again when weighing who might have been standing close enough to strike. An inquiry into the death returned findings consistent with homicide, though, as with much of this case, the formal procedural record from the initial inquest has not survived in the same detail as the later criminal trial. What is well documented is what followed. James Crichton stood trial at Perth Courthouse in 1867, charged in connection with Janet Rogers' death. The courtroom itself would have been a formal, crowded space by the standards of a provincial Scottish trial. A case of this notoriety, in a district as small as Forgandenny, drew attention from well beyond the immediate parish. The prosecution's case rested substantially on Christina Miller's account of an overheard confession, supported by circumstantial ties between Crichton and the household, his connection to Miller, his proximity to the farm, and the general suspicion that had accumulated around him over the preceding months. It was, by the standards of the evidence available, the strongest thread investigators had managed to produce in nearly a year of inquiry. But it was also, structurally, a fragile one. A single witness, recalling a private conversation, months after the fact, with no corroborating party in the room, to confirm what had or had not been said. The defense worked precisely that fragility. They questioned why Miller had waited so long to come forward. what she might have had to gain or lose by the timing of her account, and whether a confession recalled after such a gap could be trusted as verified fact rather than a memory reshaped by months of gossip, suspicion, and the accumulated pressure of a community desperate for an answer. No physical evidence tied Crichton directly to the weapon or the scene beyond his general proximity to the farm, proximity that, in a district this small, described a great many people, not merely the accused. The jury was not asked to decide guilt in isolation. They were asked to weigh a single piece of testimony against the passage of time, and time did not favor the prosecution. After deliberating for a matter of minutes, accounts describe a jury that took roughly 12 minutes to reach its decision. They returned a verdict of not proven. There was no sentence to pronounce. Scots law's third verdict left James Crichton a free man, neither cleared by acquittal nor condemned by conviction, legally innocent, publicly unresolved. He was released from the dock into a community that had already spent the better part of a year debating his guilt, and the formal machinery of Scottish criminal justice, having reached the limit of what its evidence could support, simply stopped. There was, in the end, no execution, because there was no conviction to carry one out. What followed instead was a quieter, more corrosive kind of aftermath, absorbed not by any single defendant, but by the family Janet Rogers left behind. William Henderson, her brother, never accepted the case's unresolved ending. By multiple later accounts, he spent years afterward convinced that the true circumstances of his sister's death had never been properly established, pursuing what he considered justice long after the courts had closed the matter. That pursuit, whether from grief, guilt, or genuine conviction, appears to have consumed him. William Henderson died in 1890 in Murray Royal Asylum, having spent his final years in institutional care. James Rogers, Janet's husband, outlived the trial by nearly 3 decades, dying in 1894 of gangrene, having never seen the case that took his wife resolved in any court. For over a century, the file went quiet. It sat in newspaper archives and parish records, unexamined, folded into the ordinary forgetting that swallows most 19th century crimes once the people who lived through them have died. Then, in the 2010s, a family history project brought it back into the light. Chris Payton, Janet Rogers' great-great-great-grandson and a professional genealogist, encountered that blank cause of death field on her certificate, the same blank line that opens this account, and began digging through the archives at Perth's A.K. Bell Library and the National Archives of Scotland, piecing together newspaper coverage, trial records, and parish documents that had not been assembled into a single narrative since 1867. What he found became the basis of a 2012 book re-examining the case in full, drawing renewed attention to a murder that had, by then, quietly become recognized as one of the United Kingdom's oldest unsolved killings. The rediscovery did not stop with genealogy. More recently, a criminologist at Abertay University, reviewing the surviving evidence with modern investigative frameworks rather than the assumptions available to a Perthshire jury in 1867, pointed to the deliberate covering of the body and the securing of the farmhouse as signs pointing away from a stranger and towards someone with close, familiar access to the household. Stranger killings, this later analysis noted, are statistically rare, and the composed, almost careful nature of the scene left behind suggested someone who had time, familiarity, and perhaps shame, not panic. It was a reading that pointed, however cautiously, back toward the household itself, rather than outward toward a passing ploughman. It did not produce a name the courts would accept. It could not. That threshold had closed in 1867, and nothing found in an archive a century and a half later could reopen it. What it did was reopen the question, publicly, deliberately, the very question a Perth jury had declined to answer in 12 minutes. That is, in the end, what separates this case from most of the stories told in this format. There is no tidy resolution to point to, no cell door closing, no date on a gallows record to mark as an ending. What there is instead is a woman who came to help her brother for what was meant to be a matter of weeks, a household that closed a door on its own dead rather than opening one, and a legal system that looked directly at the strongest evidence it could gather and still could not bring itself to say, with certainty, who was responsible. That unresolved verdict is not a gap in this story. It is the story. The case of Janet Rogers was the single matter examined in this account. No conviction was ever entered. No sentence was ever pronounced. The verdict, delivered in 12 minutes in a Perth courtroom in 1867, remains exactly what it was, not proven. The case became part of the national record not because it was solved, but because it was not. It has not left.